Dust coated the broken rancher's boots, but it was the silence of his 5-year-old son that truly anchored his soul to the dirt. Silas Montgomery rode into town seeking nothing more than a temporary cook. He never expected a flour-dusted woman harboring deadly secrets to resurrect his dead heart. The Wyoming wind had a way of stripping a man down to his rawest nerves, but Silas Montgomery had long since grown numb to the sting. It was the spring of 1883, and the Broken Spur Ranch was gearing up for the largest cattle drive in the county's history. Silas had 50 head of cattle to move, 15 hungry ranch hands to feed, and a heart as hollowed out as a dried riverbed. 2 years had passed since the typhoid fever swept through the valley, taking his wife, Sarah, and leaving behind a ghost of a child. Little Leo was 5 years old, with eyes the color of bruised thunderclouds and a voice that had completely vanished the day his mother was lowered into the frozen Wyoming earth. The boy hadn't spoken a single syllable since. He followed Silas like a silent shadow, a constant, heartbreaking reminder of everything the rancher had failed to protect. Silas needed a cook. His last one, an old trail hand named Barnaby, had broken his hip trying to saddle a green bronc. The spring roundup was a week away, and Silas was desperate. "Take a ride into Oak Haven, boss." His foreman, Zeke Barnes, had told him that morning over a pathetic breakfast of burnt beans and hardtack. Heard old man Higgins passed on, and his niece from back east came out to settle the estate. She's keeping the bakery open. Might be you could convince her to sling hash for a month. God knows we can't survive on my cooking. Which was how Silas found himself hitching his roan stallion to the post outside Higgins Confections and Bread. He lifted Leo down from the saddle, holding the boy's small, fragile hand in his calloused grip. A bell chimed as Silas pushed the heavy wooden door open. The air inside hit him like a physical blow, a thick, warm embrace of yeast, melted butter, and cinnamon. It was a stark contrast to the scent of manure and leather that usually clung to him. Behind the counter stood Clara Higgins. She wasn't the delicate, fainting Easterner Silas had pictured. Clara had sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing forearms dusted in white flour and scarred by oven burns. Her dark hair was escaping its messy knot, curling damply against the nape of her neck. When she looked up, her amber eyes were sharp, wary, and tired. She wiped her hands on a heavily stained apron, her posture stiffening as the imposing rancher filled her small doorway. "Can I help you, mister?" Clara asked. Her voice was steady, but Silas, a man who survived by reading the twitch of a wild horse's ears, noticed the slight tremble in her fingers as she gripped the edge of the counter. "Name's Silas Montgomery. Run the Broken Spur south of the ridge," he said, taking off his Stetson. "Looking to hire a cook for the spring roundup. 4 weeks. Rough work, but the pay is double what you're making selling penny loaves to a town half empty." Clara's gaze flicked from Silas down to the small boy clinging to his pant leg. Leo was staring at the glass display case where a single, misshapen honey biscuit sat on a doily. "I'm a baker, Mr. Montgomery, not a trail cook, and I have a business to run," Clara replied, though her eyes darted toward the back room, a flash of something akin to panic crossing her features. "Business looks slow," Silas noted bluntly, gesturing to the empty shop. Clara's jaw tightened. "It will pick up." Silas sighed, realizing his lack of tact. "Look, Miss Higgins, I've got 15 men who will ride out on empty stomachs if I don't find someone. You wouldn't have to sleep in the dirt. I've got a spare room in the main ranch house. You cook the meals, bake the bread, and you'll have enough silver to keep this place running for a year." Before Clara could issue another refusal, Leo let go of Silas's leg. The boy walked slowly to the counter, his eyes fixed on Clara. He pointed a single, dirt-smudged finger at the honey biscuit. Clara's hardened expression softened instantly. She reached into the case, pulling out the sweet, and crouched down so she was eye level with the boy. "This is a special biscuit," she murmured gently. "It got a little burned on the edges, so it needs someone brave to eat it. Do you think you can help me?" Leo didn't speak. He never did, but he reached out and took the biscuit, his small fingers brushing against Clara's. He looked at her, his big, solemn eyes locking onto hers, and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Silas felt a lump form in his throat. It was the most interaction his son had willingly initiated with a stranger in 2 years. Clara stood up, her eyes lingering on the silent boy before meeting Silas's gaze. He saw it then, the desperate calculation in her amber eyes, the undeniable reality of a woman who was drowning and had just been thrown a rope. $30 for the month, Clara said, her voice dropping to a low murmur. Paid up front, in gold, not paper script. Silas raised an eyebrow at the steep demand, but nodded. "Deal. Pack your things. Zeke will bring a wagon around for your supplies by sundown." As Silas and Leo walked out, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that Clara Higgins wasn't just struggling to keep a bakery afloat. The demand for upfront gold, the way she constantly watched the street out the window, the shadows under her eyes. The baker was running from something, and Silas, a man who preferred his ledgers balanced and his life uncomplicated, had just invited trouble right into his home. The transition to the broken spur was brutal for Clara, but she threw herself into the grueling labor with a ferocity that earned the silent respect of the ranch hands. By 4 a.m. every morning, the iron stove in the main house was blazing. She hauled cast-iron skillets heavier than a newborn calf, frying pork belly, scrambling dozens of eggs, and baking mountains of sourdough biscuits that the men devoured like starved wolves. Through it all, Clara kept her head down. But the ranch, vast and isolated, offered a strange kind of sanctuary. It was during the quiet afternoons, while the men were out in the pastures and Silas was mending fences, that the true shift happened. Leo became her shadow in the kitchen. At first, he just sat on a wooden stool in the corner, watching her knead dough with wide, unblinking eyes. Clara didn't try to coax him into talking, a relief after the endless stream of well-meaning townsfolk who constantly demanded the boy say hello. Instead, she communicated through action. She would slide a small lump of dough across the floured table toward him. On the 4th day, Leo finally reached out and squeezed the dough. By the end of the 2nd week, he was standing on a crate beside her, clumsily mimicking her kneading motions. Silas would often return to the house to find his kitchen coated in white dust, Clara laughing softly as she wiped a smudge of flour from Leo's nose. It was a sound that made Silas pause in the doorway, his chest tightening. He found himself finding excuses to return to the house early, a forgotten rope, a dull knife that needed the whetstone, just to catch a glimpse of the flour-dusted woman who was slowly breathing life back into his son. But beneath the domestic warmth, the tension in Clara was winding tighter like a coiled spring. Silas noticed the signs. Every time a rider crested the eastern ridge, Clara would drop whatever she was holding and retreat to the shadows of the pantry until the visitor was identified. She kept a small, pearl-handled derringer hidden in the deep pocket of her apron. When she thought no one was looking, she would stare at the horizon with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. Silas and Zeke had ridden out to the far boundary line to track a stray calf, leaving Clara and Leo alone at the main house. Clara was preparing pies for the evening meal, her hands deep in sliced apples and cinnamon. The sound of heavy hooves pulling up to the porch made her freeze. She quickly wiped her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peeked through the crack in the gingham curtains. A man was dismounting. He wore a long, dusty duster, a black flat-brimmed hat, and carried a lever-action Winchester rifle resting casually over his shoulder. It wasn't a ranch hand. It was Gideon Cole. Clara's breath hitched, strangling in her throat. Gideon was the chief enforcer for the Chicago syndicate she owed her life to, the men she had stolen from to pay off her late uncle's gambling debts before fleeing west. They had found her. "Leo," Clara whispered, spinning around. The boy was sitting on the floor, playing with a wooden block. "Leo, honey, you need to hide. Go under the floorboards in the pantry, now." The boy saw the sheer panic in her eyes. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled into the pantry just as heavy boot steps sounded on the wooden porch. Clara backed away from the door, her hand slipping into her apron pocket to grip the cold metal of the derringer. Knock, knock, knock. "Miss Higgins?" a gravelly voice called out. "Or should I say, Miss Clara Rutherford? I know you're in there, songbird. I can smell the sugar." Clara didn't make a sound. She prayed the door was locked tight enough. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled violently, and a heavy shoulder slammed against the wood. The hinges groaned. Before Gideon could break the door down, a gunshot echoed from the distance. A warning shot fired into the air. "Hey, get away from that door!" Silas's voice boomed across the yard. He had returned early, spotting the strange horse tied to his post. Clara heard Gideon curse under his breath. "We ain't done, Clara," the enforcer hissed through the wood. Footsteps retreated rapidly. By the time Clara unbolted the door and stumbled out, Gideon was already galloping hard toward the tree line with Silas holding his peacemaker revolver, watching the dust settle. Silas turned to Clara, his eyes hard and demanding answers. "Who was that?" Clara was trembling so violently she had to lean against the doorframe. "Just a lost traveler," she lied, her voice cracking. Silas stepped onto the porch, towering over her. "Travelers don't try to bust down doors, and travelers don't ride out like the devil is on their heels when a gun is fired. Who are you running from, Clara?" Before she could form another lie, a small tug on Silas's pant leg made them both look down. Leo had emerged from the house. He wasn't crying, but his small face was pale. He tugged his father's leg again, then pointed back into the kitchen. Silas and Clara rushed inside. A heavy sack of flour had been knocked off the counter during the commotion, spilling a thick white canvas across the dark oak floorboards. Leo walked to the center of the spilled flour. He knelt down. With a remarkably steady finger, the silent child began to trace a shape in the white powder. Clara gasped, clapping her hands over her mouth as the drawing took form. It wasn't a child's scribble of a horse or a dog. Leo drew a perfect, intricate crest. A serpent wrapped around a cracked skull. Silas's blood ran cold. It was the exact brand used by the Blackwood Syndicate, a ruthless gang of outlaws and extortionists that operated out of the Dakota Territories, the very same men who had ruthlessly driven Silas's own brother off his land 5 years ago. But it wasn't just the symbol that paralyzed Silas. It was the fact that Leo had seen the man through the window, recognized the silver pin Gideon wore on his lapel, and communicated it. "Leo," Silas whispered, dropping to his knees beside his son. "Where did you see this?" Leo looked at his father, then pointed a flour-dusted finger directly at Clara. The air in the kitchen vanished. Silas slowly stood up, turning his gaze to the baker. The vulnerability he had felt for her over the past weeks instantly hardened into a dangerous protective ice. "The Blackwood Syndicate," Silas said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "You brought the Blackwoods to my ranch, to my son." Clara backed up against the stove, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "Silas, please, I didn't mean to. I had no choice." "Pack your bags," Silas said, turning his back on her. "I'm riding you to the sheriff in Oak Haven. Whatever mess you're in, it stops at my property line." But as Silas reached for Leo's hand to pull him away, the boy did something that shattered the quiet kitchen. Leo planted his feet firmly in the floorboards. He ripped his hand out of his father's grasp, ran over to Clara, and wrapped his arms fiercely around her waist, burying his face in her flour-stained apron. And then, for the first time in 2 torturous years, the 5-year-old spoke. His voice was raspy, broken, and small, but the words echoed like a gunshot. "Don't let them take my mama." The word hung in the air, heavier than the suffocating Wyoming heat. "Mama." Silas Montgomery stopped breathing. The peacemaker revolver in his hand suddenly felt like an anvil. For 2 agonizing years he had prayed to every star in the western sky to hear his son's voice. He had spent fortunes on doctors in Cheyenne, endured the pity and whispers of the townsfolk, and sat awake countless nights listening to the agonizing silence of the boy's bedroom. And now, the silence was broken not for him, but to protect a woman who had brought death to their doorstep. Leo's small fingers were digging into the thick canvas of Clara's apron, his knuckles white. Clara sank to her knees, heedless of the spilled flour, and wrapped her arms around the trembling boy. She buried her face in his shoulder, a ragged sob tearing from her throat. Silas lowered his gun, his mind spinning, but his voice remained dangerously low. "You have exactly 1 minute to tell me the truth, Clara, and God help you if you lie to me again." Clara pulled back, wiping her flour-streaked face. Her amber eyes, usually so guarded, were completely shattered. "My real name is Clara Rutherford," she began, her voice quivering but gaining strength. "My husband was Josiah Rutherford. He wasn't a gambler, Silas. That was a lie the Blackwoods spread to cover up his murder. Josiah was a forensic bookkeeper for the territorial government in Cheyenne." Silas's brow furrowed. A bookkeeper. "He was auditing the territorial land grants," Clara explained, speaking rapidly as the adrenaline flooded her veins. "He found discrepancies, massive ones. The Blackwood Syndicate wasn't just rustling cattle and extorting small ranchers like your brother. They were buying politicians. Josiah found the master ledger. It had real names, Silas. Names of men who sit in velvet chairs in Cheyenne. Judges, sheriffs, even men close to Governor William Hale himself. They were all taking blood money from the Blackwoods to look the other way." Silas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The corruption in the Wyoming territory was an open secret, but hard proof was a death sentence. "And Josiah took the ledger?" Clara nodded, a fresh tear cutting through the dust on her cheek. "He brought it home. He was trying to contact William A. Pinkerton at the National Detective Agency in Chicago to hand it over. But the Blackwoods found out. Gideon Cole and his men broke into our home. They shot Josiah right in front of me." Her voice cracked, and Leo tightened his grip around her neck. "I barely escaped. I grabbed the ledger, fled on a freight train, and assumed my late uncle's identity here in Oak Haven. I've been hiding the book inside the false bottom of a flour barrel in your barn." Silas stared at her. The anger that had boiled inside him just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a profound, chilling realization. This woman wasn't a criminal. She was a survivor carrying a fuse that could blow the most corrupt syndicate in the West straight to hell. And, more importantly, she had given his son a reason to speak again. He looked down at Leo. The boy's storm cloud eyes met his father's, fierce and unyielding. Silas holstered his revolver. He walked over, knelt beside them, and placed a large, calloused hand on Clara's shoulder. The touch made her flinch, but then she leaned into the warmth of it. "Zeke!" Silas's voice suddenly roared, shaking the glass in the window panes. Boot steps thundered across the porch as the foreman burst through the door, rifle drawn. "Boss, heard yellin'. Who was that rider?" "Trouble," Silas said grimly, standing up to his full, towering height. "Gideon Cole and the Blackwoods. They'll be back by nightfall, and they won't be coming just to talk." Silas looked at his foreman, his jaw set like granite. "Ride out and gather Wyatt, Caleb, and the rest of the boys. Barricade the bunkhouse and the main house. Move the horses to the box canyon." Zeke looked at the spilled flour, at the trembling woman, and at the silent boy who was finally speaking in soft, tearful hiccups. The foreman didn't ask questions. He just tipped his hat. "Yes, boss, we're with you." As Zeke ran out, Silas turned to Clara. "Where is the ledger exactly?" "Third stall in the barn," Clara whispered, "under the empty grain sacks." "I'll get it," Silas said. "You take Leo down to the root cellar. Lock the heavy iron bolt from the inside. Do not come out until I tell you." He paused, reaching out to gently brush a lock of hair from Clara's face. The harsh Wyoming light caught the fierce determination in his eyes. "I lost my family once to something I couldn't fight. I won't let it happen again." The attack came precisely at midnight, heralded by the haunting howl of a coyote that was cut abruptly short by the crack of a Winchester rifle. In the pitch-black root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards, Clara held Leo tight to her chest, surrounded by jars of preserved peaches and pickled beets. Above them, the ranch erupted into chaos. Gunfire rattled like a violent hailstorm against the thick log walls of the main house. The shouts of Silas's men echoed through the valley, met by the ruthless returned fire of the Blackwood Syndicate. Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had the pearl-handled Derringer gripped so tightly her hand cramped. But the terror in her chest wasn't for herself anymore. It was for the tall, quiet rancher up above who was fighting a war that wasn't his. Then a smell drifted down through the floorboards. Smoke. Clara's blood ran cold. The syndicate wasn't just trying to shoot their way in. They were trying to burn the broken spur to the ground. The ledger, Clara thought in a panic. Silas hadn't had time to retrieve it from the barn before the shooting started. If the barn burned, the proof of Josiah's murder and the syndicate's corruption would turn to ash. The Blackwoods would win, and Silas's men would die for nothing. "Leo," Clara whispered urgently into the darkness, "I need you to be the bravest boy in the world. Hide behind these barrels. Do not make a sound." Leo looked up at her, terrified, but he nodded. He scrambled behind a large wooden cask of salted pork. Clara unbolted the cellar door and crept up the wooden stairs. The kitchen was thick with smoke, illuminated by the flashing muzzle bursts from the windows where Zeke and Silas were firing into the night. "They're flanking the barn, boss," Zeke yelled over the deafening roar of gunfire. "They're trying to torch the hayloft," Silas cursed, reloading his rifle. "Hold the house." Clara didn't wait. She slipped out the back kitchen door into the chaotic, gun-smoke-filled night. She sprinted across the open yard, the darkness her only shield. Bullets whizzed past her like angry hornets, kicking up dirt at her heels. She threw herself through the side door of the barn just as a flaming torch was thrown through the loft window above. The barn was dimly lit by the growing fire above. Clara scrambled toward the third stall, digging frantically through the heavy grain sacks. Her fingers brushed the cold leather binding of the ledger. She pulled it out, clutching it to her chest. Well, look what the rat dragged out. Clara froze. She turned slowly. Gideon Cole stood blocking the barn door, his face illuminated by the eerie orange glow of the burning loft. He held a Colt revolver pointed directly at her chest. "You caused a lot of trouble, Clara," Gideon sneered, stepping closer, the smell of whiskey and chewing tobacco radiating off him. "Governor Hale's friends are getting mighty impatient. Hand over the book." Clara backed up, her boots crunching against the hay. She bumped into the wooden grinding mill Silas used for feed. Resting on top of it were 3 massive 50-pound sacks of raw baking flour she had requested just days prior. An old, dangerous baker's secret flashed through her mind. Fine particulate matter, when suspended in the air and introduced to a spark, was more volatile than dynamite. "I said, hand it over," Gideon shouted, cocking the hammer of his gun. Clara didn't hesitate. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the heavy iron hook used for hauling feed, swung it hard, and slashed open the 3 massive sacks of flour. A thick, suffocating cloud of white dust exploded into the air, instantly filling the enclosed space of the barn. It coated the air like a blinding blizzard. Gideon coughed violently, blinded by the sudden whiteout. "You stupid!" Clara dropped to the floor, raised her derringer toward the lantern hanging on the wall right next to Gideon, and pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered the glass lantern. The open flame hit the dense, suspended cloud of flour dust. The thermobaric explosion was instantaneous and deafening. A massive shock wave of fire and concussive force ripped through the barn. The blast blew the heavy double doors completely off their iron hinges, sending them flying into the muddy yard. Clara, shielded by the heavy oak feed trough, covered her ears as the heat washed over her. When the roar subsided, the barn was eerily quiet, save for the crackle of the hayloft. Clara coughed, peering through the settling white dust and smoke. Gideon Cole lay unconscious on the ground, thrown 20 feet by the blast, his clothes singed and his gun nowhere to be found. Suddenly, heavy boots rushed into the barn. Silas appeared through the smoke, his face pale with terror. When he saw Clara rising from the floor, clutching the ledger, he dropped his rifle and crossed the distance in 2 massive strides. He pulled her into a desperate, crushing embrace, burying his face in her flour-dusted hair. "You foolish, brave woman," he breathed, his voice trembling. Outside, the explosion had thrown the remaining syndicate members into a panic. Seeing their leader down and the barn blown to splinters, the remaining outlaws broke rank and fled into the night, pursued by the relentless gunfire of Silas's ranch hands. Clara looked up at Silas, her amber eyes shining in the firelight. She held up the leather-bound book. "I got it." Silas smiled, a genuine, breathtaking smile that erased years of grief from his face. "Yes, you did. Now let's go get our son." 3 days later, heavily armed Pinkerton agents, led by William A. Pinkerton himself, arrived at the Broken Spur to collect the ledger and Gideon Cole. The evidence within those pages would spark the largest federal corruption raid in the history of the Wyoming Territory, tearing down the Blackwood Syndicate down to its roots. The dust settled over the broken spur, but the heavy silence was gone forever. The ledger dismantled the Blackwood Syndicate, trading a violent nightmare for lasting peace. Clara never returned to Oak Haven. She traded penny loaves for a lifetime of ranch sunrises. Silas Montgomery found more than a cook, and little Leo finally found his voice, proving that the sweetest salvation is often built from the ashes of our secrets.